Now sadly this is going to be much more boring than no elves. Not a single chance. I'm talking about Lutheranism or Lutheran spirituality in Great Britain. And I do have to start with a bit of historical background because
there's a microphone.
A little bit down, or is one of the
I think. Is that better? No?
No.
I wonder if it's too loud.
Too loud?
Oh. Try now. Try now.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I do have to go back historic. I do have to back historically because there's no other way of understanding it, unfortunately. So bear with me while I put in a little bit of historical background. So the history of the presence of Lutherans in Great Britain dates back really to the very beginning of the Reformation. Or perhaps you might say that the ideas of the Lutheran Reformation were present in various parts of the Atlantic Isles, the British Isles, as early as the 1520s, so very early in the Reformation process. The first Lutheran martyrdom in the British Isles was in Scotland, and it was the death of Patrick Hamilton. This man, Patricius Hamilton, it says, he was very young when he was martyred, and he was the author of a very concise and very orthodox Lutheran statement, which was based actually on Melanchthon's Laudae Communes, and it was known popularly in Britain as Patrick's Places, which is quite nice, I think. Well, the first postulate of this document reads like this. They erroneously conceive of an opinion of salvation in the law, which is only to be sought in the faith of Christ and in no other. So this is a statement which is purely Lutheran. It's an absolutely Lutheran statement, and it was enough for Hamilton to be burned for heresy outside St. Salvator's Chapel, or St. Saviour's, as we might call it, in the town of St. Andrews in 1528. But as with martyrdoms throughout the ages, his steadfast faith and his refusal to recant turned out to be counterproductive. And as it says here also on this plaque in his memory, the reek or the smell of Master Patrick Hamilton infected as many as it blew upon. And that became a saying to explain the spread of the Reformation in Scotland, even though that in the end was more Calvinist than it was Lutheran. So Hamilton stand, together with others such as Robert Barnes, who was the first English Lutheran martyr, was largely based on their contacts with prominent Lutherans, with Melanchthon, of course, as we said, but also with Johannes Bugenhagen and with Luther himself. Barnes was an interesting man. He was instrumental in the move which brought England very close to being a Lutheran country. It really was very close. It could have happened. Because what happened was that Thomas Cromwell, who was the first Protestant Chancellor of the country under King Henry VIII, the one who had 6 wives, he was charged, Thomas Cromwell, with the delicate negotiations for Henry VIII to get a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And as a part of this, one of the things that Cromwell did was that he tried to promote an alliance with the Smalcald League. A little unknown part of history, I think. And that would have meant King Henry affirming the Augsburg Confession. They met from both sides for discussion, including Robert Barnes and also Melanchthon, but it failed. And in the end, Robert Barnes too was burned at the stake in 1540, and Britain began a longish period of religious strife and bloodshed, and Lutherans were persecuted by both sides, the Catholics and the Reformed. Now I'm going to skip over a lot of history. At the time of really bitter interdenominational warfare ended, to put it at very simplest, with something called an Act of Uniformity, passed during the reign of Elizabeth I in 1559. And it was like you mentioned, Jenny, Sweden, that you were only permitted to worship according to the Swedish Lutheran rite. Well, it was the same thing in England. You could only be an Anglican, you could only worship according to Anglican rites, specifically the Book of Common Prayer and nothing else. And you had to attend an Anglican church weekly, every week. If you didn't, you were fined. And the aim was to do the same thing as the Nordic churches did. The aim was to make the Church of England the Volkskirche, the folk church of England. It was an aim to make it a church which united everybody in worship across chasms of social inequality, religious affiliation and ethnic origin. Come to that. So let's miss out on the whole century. We will miss out the Civil War and the Puritan regime and come back to 1662, because this is where it gets interesting. There was another Act of Uniformity in 1662, again reaffirming this, this absolute supremacy of the Church of England. And at that point, Lutheranism had, to all intents and purposes, disappeared from the British Isles. As far as we know, there were no Lutherans left at all. Now, why all this background and why all of this? Well, there was a little chink. There were a few Lutherans around because there was the Steel Yard, which was the home to Hanseatic traders in London around that time. And they had this area called the Steel Yard, the site still exists, which was a little bit of Germany, actually, in London. They could do their own thing. But then in 1665 and 1666, two terrible things happened in England, which you will probably have heard of. In 1665 there was the plague, which killed millions of people. It was a terrible, terrible, destructive time. People died in large numbers. And it was followed in 1666 by the Great Fire of London, which was a blessing in some ways because it killed the rats, which bore the fleas, which bore the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which caused the plague. But London was destroyed. That's the thing. London was destroyed, and there were not enough people left to rebuild London. So craftsmen were brought in particularly from Sweden and Denmark, and some from northern Germany, who came in to rebuild the city of London. And in 1668, a Lutheran pastor, Gerhard Martins, who was German and Swedish, came to London. And the thing was that they wanted to worship in Lutheran, if you like. They didn't want to go to an Anglican church. And the Swedish ambassador, Sir John Bachman Leonberg, it doesn't sound very Swedish, but I expect it is, he petitioned the king, King Charles II by that time, for permission to build a Lutheran church, breaking the Act of Uniformity, you see. And in 1669, the king agreed to this. So the Lutherans were the first denomination to break into this uniformly Anglican picture that existed at that time. A church was built, Holy Trinity, and a charter was granted, allowing people, companions of the Augustan profession, to worship in their own way. So here are the two documents. You can't read them, but they exist. They are still there in the Guildhall Library, and you can go and have a look at the Lutheran permissions. So this church was built, the Hamburg Lutheran Church. This also doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed much later. And the work in London, oh yes, let's just skip over this quickly, but in essence, the Charter ensured their right to worship, their right to build a church, and crucially for all Lutherans to use the one building, and for the Church of England to respect their rights, which has been crucial actually to Lutheranism ever since. So the Trinity Church was built, and the builder was a Danish Lutheran, Caius Sibber, who rather wanted... Why does this not go on? Please. Oh, here we are. He worked for free, and he pledged a sum of money for his entire life to support this worshipping community. Now, this forms the two kind of integral parts of where Lutherans have been ever since then, funnily enough. Firstly, the first worshippers were all immigrants. They weren't local English people at all. They were Nordic immigrants by and large. And secondly, the fact that they shared a building, that there were certainly Swedes, Germans, Danes who all worshipped in the same building. And immigration has been the thing that has built up Lutheranism in Great Britain ever since. In the 17th century, therefore, we had the first Danish-Norwegian church in Wapping, which was a parish church and a seaman's church. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was firstly the German influence with the royal family becoming German. Prince Albert, of course, famously. 1710, the first Swedish congregation in London, and they built their own church. The oldest German Lutheran church was built again in the 18th century. It's the oldest surviving German church building in London. And in 100 years later, in 1868, a Norwegian church was built in the Docklands area in Rotherhithe. And around the same sort of time, a Finnish church was also established. Yeah, that's a map of the Lutheran presence in the city of London. This is the Norwegian church now. It's a very beautiful church. If you ever go to London, have a chance to go to Rotherhithe, it's in a beautiful place, and it's still a functioning church, of course. So that's one thing. And then the next thing that happened was that there was, in the 20th century, there were new waves of immigrants. After World War II, Baltic, Polish, German immigrants, of course. After 1956, Hungarian immigrants. In the 1960s, Guyanese, so people from the Caribbean. From 1970s onwards, East Africans, Tanzanians mainly, but also Kenyans. And from the 1990s, as a result of the Ethiopian-Eritrean War, people from the Horn of Africa. And a new wave of East Europeans, of course, people from, or I shouldn't say East Europeans of us, but people from Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and so on, who came to live in England. So this is very much the story of an immigrant church. It's worth mentioning that there is another Lutheran church in England, the Missouri Synod-related church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of England, which has struggled heroically over the years to try to reach out to local English people, and almost completely failed, I have to say. Evangelism by Lutherans amongst the English has not really worked. So, this is a picture of an Eritrean Lutheran choir who sing beautifully. I tried to find a snippet to play you, and I couldn't find anything on the internet. But they're wonderful. Very ancient sound. It feels as though it's coming to you across the centuries when they sing. And they are pretty characteristic of the Lutheran presence in Britain today. because there are congregations which are Danish, Eritrean, Estonian, Finnish, German, probably Hungarian, I'm not sure whether they still worship together anymore, Icelandic, and Ada is one of the pastors who cares for them, Latvian, the Lutheran Church in Great Britain, which is an international church, Norwegian, Polish, Swahili speaking, Swedish, yeah. And this is a picture of the pastors, by and large, of the Lutheran Church in Great Britain, taken just a few weeks ago with the installation of the new Norwegian bishop. And you can see that this is quite a diverse bunch of people. The current pastors of the Lutheran Church in Great Britain are 4 Polish, 1 Norwegian, 3 Latvian, 2 Tanzanians, 2 Chinese, a Belgian, 2 English, and 4 Americans.
And no British.
Sorry?
No British.
Well, 2 English.
Oh, 2 English.
British. So how to begin to describe the spirituality of this presence? Because obviously it is enormously diverse. I don't think it's possible to speak about a unity of spirituality in the Lutheran presence in Great Britain, but that makes it more interesting in some ways. As you can see, these are snapshots of 3 services. On the left-hand side, it's from a Polish service with people dressed in talas and so on. Again, an Eritrean group of young people at their confirmation, and an East African congregation on the bottom. Now, I will also define spirituality, but completely differently, I think, from what you have done. This is from an American theologian, Bradley Hanson, who has a book called A Graceful Life, Lutheran Spirituality for Today. And he, near the beginning of the book, says, some Lutherans will ask, Lutheran spirituality, isn't that an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms? And then he goes on to describe what this actually means outside what Jenny called the smorgasbord of different spiritual influences. So how he defines it, Bradley Hanson, is to say that spirituality is a useful way of talking about the ways we human spirits transcend our immediate circumstances and ask about a larger reality and meaning. So, a spirituality is a lived faith plus a path. So it's the faith that we hold plus the path that we walk to follow this faith. So in this sense, we can't actually talk about a sort of generic spirituality, because we're talking about a specific faith to which people belong and commit, in which we believe and in whose God we trust, and then a path which we follow, which will be different from place to place, from person to person. Maybe shared with other people at some points, maybe walked alone with God at other points, but the only 2 persons that are there for the whole journey are we ourselves and God. So I think for the Lutherans in Great Britain, therefore, to define this central faith to which we held, which held us together, in as much as it did hold us together, was very important. Because without that, we are completely desperate, because because we are all following different paths. So the central core was terribly important, and you can name them just as well as I can. The creeds, the confessions, membership of a community gathered around the gospel rightly taught and the sacraments rightly administered, and crucially service to others, diaconia. I think immigrant populations, immigrant congregations, diaconia is crucial, because there is always somebody who needs to look after somebody who can do it. So what does this look like in practice, especially in the context of what is actually a small, relatively, but very diverse Lutheran community. There are maybe 200,000 Lutherans in total in Great Britain, ranging through all those nationalities that I mentioned.
What's the population of Britain?
About 60 million, maybe. So somebody can work out the percentage, not me. So, now, crucially, I think, for us, there were two texts from Luther which were important. This is the introduction to the Deutsche Messe in 1526, when Luther is asked to provide a form of worship that will do for absolutely everybody, and he refuses to do it. Because basically he says you have to contextualize your own worship, that this is important. In other words, all who see or desire to observe this our order of divine service, on no account to make of it a compulsory law, to ensnare or make captive thereby any man's conscience, but to use it agreeably to Christian liberty, at their good pleasure, as, where and when, and so long as circumstances favour and demand it. In other words, find your own way of worshipping. Yes, the other one is one that was written to the Livonians, to us, in 1525, when, again, he emphasises the same thing. Councils were held, all sorts of rulings and canons made in order to hold all the people to common order. But in the end, these rulings became snares for the soul and pitfalls for the faith. For those who devise and ordain universal customs and orders get so wrapped up in them that they make them into dictatorial laws opposed to the freedom of faith. That resonates with me.
Very much today.
Yes, and with what Dutzer said to us as well, I have to say. So, these two principles, that there is no one Lutheran law to fit everybody. There's no one Lutheran form of worship to fit everybody, but there is this core of the faith which holds us together. Yes. If we see Lutherans of all races and all ages, of many languages, dressed in everything from jeans and t-shirts through Swedish folk costumes to African robes, singing everything from traditional 16th century hymns to African gospel and American worship songs, receiving communion in quietness at the altar or dancing forwards clapping their hands, and yet able to hold together in a single church body, this actually is a tremendous witness to the strength of the core of Lutheran spirituality. Because despite the external differences that were there, and they were very great, the essentials of faith continue to hold us together. And they seem to be able, thank God, to supersede the divisions that we, like Lutherans the world over, were subject to, but where we found our unity in the ancient truths. So just to finish with, for a while I served as pastor in charge of an Eritrean congregation in London. I don't speak Tigrinya, which was the majority language of this Eritrean congregation. I didn't understand almost a word of what they said, because Tigrinya is a terribly hard language to learn. There were a few, obviously, Semitic words which leapt out, like mizmur and salam and shukran, but nobody would guess the word for God, which, there are two words for God and Lord. One looks like this, and it bears no relation to any other word for God that I've ever come across. It's Exabier. Exabier. And then there's another one which we wouldn't recognise, but which does sound a little bit more familiar, which is Amlak, which is related obviously to Malak, Moloch, all those words. But why I mention this is that the Eritreans had been evangelised by the Swedes long ago. So their hymn book was full of Swedish hymns, sung in Tigrinya. And it was a really marvellous experience, actually, to see the old hymns, the old tunes, but set contextually in a way that they could use. It was rather wonderful. They also had a custom, which was familiar to me as well, of interrogating their confirmation candidates on the catechism in front of the whole congregation before they could be confirmed. Terrible. They used to do that. Brought back very unpleasant memories of my own youth. But so to sum up, in Hanson's terms then, the faith which we all lived was the same, but the paths that we followed definitely weren't. But they were always in each other's sight. So we weren't walking kind of at right angles to each other, further and further away, but our paths kind of crossed, intertwined, were in parallel to each other, but we never grew more and more distant, mostly. One very last thought. In addition to our Lutheran roots and all the cultural overlays, our identity was formed by the fact that we were a very small minority denomination against the background of a state church. The Church of England, obviously, but also all the much larger denominations like the Roman Catholics, the Methodists, the Baptists, Pentecostals, Orthodox, and so on. So the path that we also followed was the path of a small, powerless church. We were home to migrants, we were home to aliens, the poor, the displaced. It was the spirituality, if you like, of marginalisation, which is very different to the spirituality of a large, powerful church. And I think the paradigm that minority churches offer the world is of a church presence that is weak and vulnerable. It's poor and marginalised. It's unsuccessful in worldly terms. And this is a model that, for me at least, resonates with the theology of the cross, of God being most present where he seems to be most absent. It suggests mission and service that serves the vulnerable, accompanies the vulnerable from a position of vulnerability and not from a position of power. The Meissen Agreement has something to say about this, and I wanted to quote this, that smaller church institutions are perhaps more aware of the ambiguity and frailty that they share with the human condition, and they remain aware, often acutely so, of the need for repentance, reform and renewal, because that's the only way a minority church can continue to exist. And I think this is a paradigm of church identity which is becoming ever more relevant, even to formerly large churches. And we heard about the Nordic churches and the numbers which are dropping. In Europe, fewer and fewer people each year seem to identify as Christians or are members of churches. We live in a time of unrest, a world where inequality grows year by year, where the parable of Lazarus and Dives is relevant in a very real sense. So my last question is, in this current state of the world, where is it that churches want to be? Do we want to be at a prayer breakfast with the powerful and the rich, who are pretending to a faith that mostly they don't have, and certainly don't practice? Or do we want to be on the streets with the homeless, the hungry, offering them a church home, and offering them food both spiritually and bodily? And this is the challenge that minority, diverse churches offer to the world today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana. And is there somebody who can already voice a question? Or already to think?
Thank you very much, Jana. In April, I visited the Synod of the Lutheran Church in Great Britain, and you helped me to understand what I experienced, because I was very, very impressed that I could feel the liberating power of Lutheran confession in a way I hardly experienced in a majority context. So I was amazed about the diverse the diversity of the congregation and their, it was moving that each one of them had a very individual story how he or she got there, and that it was a place to be the way you are. And so thank you for your speech.
Thank you so much for sharing your visions and your insights. I was wondering if you would comment to the expression people of faith. I'm thinking how the world is looking today and the challenge we foresee. Can we go on talking about Lutheran identity and spirituality and stop there, or isn't it time to open up and find alliances to save the world? And then I think I have noticed that people of faith is an expression. People of faith are very often open to, I'm not the center of this world, there is a meaning, there is a path. And could the image you used about we have something, there is a center, and then we choose different paths, would you use that also when it comes to people of faith, that general expression?
Well, that's a stupendous question, actually, and it's one that we, all of us, have to answer, I think, in this century. What I'd say and this is purely speaking from experience, is that actually in many ways it's helpful for you to be secure in your own identity in order to then reach out to others and work together with them. And certainly I think it's quite clear that all the major problems of the world, no one nation, no one church, no one government, no one anything is going to be able to solve. We are going to have to work together. But I think it is then helpful for us to be secure where we are in our identity and our understanding, and then we can join hands with others who may challenge our identity after that. That's perfectly possible. Knowing your own identity doesn't deny the other. It's simply a security that you have, which enables you actually to accept the other more easily quite often. It's when you're not secure in yourself and that the other becomes more threatening, I think. When you're secure in yourself, your identity, your faith identity, then other people of faith are your brothers and sisters with whom you work and with whom you cooperate. So I think